Hi, I'm your host, Dr. Ina Conboy. The following episode is very special for two reasons. One is that I truly believe that the subject of consciousness is super interesting and important, and the person who we will be speaking with is incredibly knowledgeable. The second reason is that this episode, which will be broken into two parts due to its length, is the season finale. It is difficult for me to believe that I am at the end of season 1. I have learned a great deal on how to podcast, and I have already started to work on season 2. One of the major changes that will happen in season 2 is that since Apple Podcast started allowing video podcasting, season 2 will include videos on the Apple podcasting platform. I've already been releasing video podcasts through Spotify and YouTube, but this will be a great addition to Apple. I have a lot of delicious and mind-bending conversations planned for season 2. It will start at the end of August of 2026, and my guests and I will be covering subjects such as synchronicity, remote viewing, psychic abilities, what physics has to say about anomalous experiences, and so much more. Finally, and most importantly, I want to thank you, the listener. Whether this is your first time tuning in or you've listened to my other episodes before, I am so very grateful that you are here and engaging. This is one of the main reasons why I have created the Quantum Couch, to forge connections and foster interesting conversations in order for us to better understand ourselves and the world around us. And what better way to do that than through each other? So thank you so much for being a part of my and the Quantum Couch's journey. Without further ado, let us start the season finale. Welcome back to the Quantum Couch. Today's conversation explores consciousness. You may ask, why would someone want to study consciousness? Well, because at some point, every serious question turns into a question about consciousness. Consciousness is the only thing we cannot step outside of. We can study stars, markets, even the brain, but all of that is known through consciousness. It's the medium of experience itself. So the question becomes, how can we explain reality without understanding the very thing that experiences it? Neuroscience explains correlates of consciousness beautifully regarding neurons and networks and such. However, it doesn't explain why experience exists at all, why there is someone inside the system, and why subjective experience feels like anything. To dig into the complexity of consciousness with me is Dr. Jeffrey Dunne, who is a scientist, author, and a creative thinker. Dr. Jeffrey Dunne is the president of the International Consciousness Research Laboratories, known as ICRL, a charitable research organization established in the late 1990s to build upon the foundation established by the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research, PEAR, laboratory. In this role, Dr. Dunne runs a variety of research and outreach activities focused on exploring the nature of consciousness, particularly as it relates to space, time, and language. In addition to his role with ICRL, Jeff is a researcher and chief scientist at the Johns Hopkins University, working over the past 30 years in a variety of fields ranging from acoustics and cybersecurity to data science and artificial intelligence. He's also an award-winning author and playwright with nearly 200 plays performed over 4 continents. In his 2023 novel, Nexus, Jeff unites 3 decades of scientific experience with 4 decades of pursuits in philosophy and metaphysics to weave a story introducing the scientific principle of syntropy and its importance in finding balance at every scale, personal, societal, and global. Dr. Dunne holds a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering, as well as a Master of Science and a Ph.D. in Experimental Physics. Dr. Dunne, welcome to the Quantum Couch. Thank you so much for being here and speaking with me.
It is my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
So I was wondering if maybe we can start this conversation because we have so many people here who are not scientists and who are not philosophers, maybe starting to talk about consciousness in a way that we can break it down. I mean, can you define what you mean by when you're going to be talking about consciousness and why do you study it?
Yeah, a really important question because, in fact, one of the biggest problems or challenges within the field of consciousness research is a lack of common vocabulary in any of this. Different people when they talk about consciousness or spirituality or even the terms religion and all of that mean very different things by it. Um, to give you a sense of what I mean by consciousness, it's probably useful to take a step back and just talk for a moment about what sort of the nature of reality. In the way that I view things based on the essentially the data that I have seen over the course of years, I've found myself coming to the conclusion that the universe as we experience it is a kind of a description of the universe that is as much or maybe even more grounded in the way that we interpret our experiences and our sensations than in terms of some kind of objective outside has nothing to do with me structure, which is something that even modern science at this point is coming to agree with. If you look at quantum mechanics, it's saying, hey, wait a minute, a particle doesn't actually have a position in space. It only has a position when we measure it to have a position and we assert these sorts of things. There's strong implications, to say the least, that the structure of the universe is a result of the way that we're experiencing it. So, with that kind of pre answer in place, when we say, what is consciousness? For me, the thing that has an awareness in order to have an experience, a thing that has some kind of intention or will to have experiences and to make sense of experiences. That's the core of what we're really working with. That's the core of the self. And consciousness is that combination of awareness and intention, right? Of being able to perceive and being able to have some kind of will through which to make a choice. Am I going to have an experience, experience A versus experience B, or so forth? In consciousness, that's that piece that is essentially ourselves, um, and is having the awareness experience. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
It
It's
does
vague.
to me. However, I'm
Okay,
wondering if maybe you can give some concrete example of what you're talking about. Like if me as a human being, I'm experiencing this world, how do I experience consciousness? Like what is consciousness within me, I guess, like in
right.
a day-to-day basis?
So consciousness is the thing that's doing the experiencing of the day-to-day basis. So, we, for example, typically, because of the way that science and the medical community have evolved over the last couple of hundred years, have tied ourselves into the idea that, well, we've got atoms. Atoms are put together as cells, and cells or molecules and cells, and these cells are doing a thing. And in the brain, there are these neurons that are firing back and forth, and somehow, poof, magically, there's a consciousness that's there. The challenge with that is that the evidence doesn't suggest or doesn't support that way of looking at things. For example, there are a tremendous number of documented cases where all brain activity has ceased, and yet a person will come out of a state of death, come out of a coma, come out of whatever it is. State of death is better because there's literally no brain activity. Come back and be able to tell you exactly what was happening in the room while they were in that state. All right.
Mhm.
So there's something that is telling us there that whatever that consciousness is, that awareness exists not within the brain, but rather in some kind of larger sense, right? It's the natural question is where, but the problem is that where implies space. I would make the argument that space is a tool of consciousness to organize experiences. So the very question of where is it is sort of like, well, you're already kind of cornering yourself into the idea that there's in here and not in here as a fundamental thing, which is not really supported by the evidence. So from a practical perspective, what is consciousness? Let's say that you have somebody who's in the process of a near-death experience, and they
Mhm.
are aware of all these different things. I'm aware that I was hit by a car, aware that there is somebody who's performing CPR. I'm aware of an ambulance. I'm aware of a hospital. Not within time and space, because those are things that typically are inserted after the person wakes up. But consciousness is that thing that is recognizing all those experiences and ultimately able to make sense out of them, to talk about them, whether in reflection as memory, as cast into words in order to say that to somebody else, like I just said it to you,
Mhm.
right? I put the words, hit by a car, that's words, that's not the actual being hit by a car sensation or experience. That's a description of the experience. And consciousness is the thing that's taking those experienced things, right? Those sensations, and being able to be reflective about it, to say, aha, this is a thing. This is something I want to make sense of. I want to be able to explain it to somebody else and to find a way to do that, at least to the extent that language allows us to. Some experiences can't. For example, people also will talk during near death experiences of having this sense of oneness with everything that's very difficult to express in a language that's designed around the idea that there is a Jeff and there's Indiana, and we're not the same thing fundamentally, right? So language sometimes gets in the way of being able to express that too. But ultimately, consciousness is the thing that is doing all of the experiencing and making the
Mhm.
choices related to that. Does that help, or did I kind of
No, that was actually
Okay,
excellent. Yes, thank you for
okay,
breaking that down really well. So you mentioned near-death experiences. I think that you and I both know that there's been a lot of research on near-death experiences. Can you talk a little bit about what near-death experience, I guess, uh, is officially, and what do people experience? And there, I think there's a general thing that a lot of people experience. Almost
yeah,
every single person that went through a near-death experience, and I think for a lot of people, they may not realize that it's a pretty common phenomena that is documented all over the world, especially physicians have been documenting too, who
yeah.
have had their patients telling them about it. Can you speak to that a bit, if possible?
Sure, yeah. So the near death experience is a very powerful piece of evidence that our idea of what self is, what awareness is, and so forth is not the traditional, well, my neurons are firing and therefore, because it really shows that the brain activity and the awareness are not in that kind of causal relationship. The number of people who have had near death experiences is substantial. And I don't know the
Mhm.
exact number, but we're not talking about tens of thousands of people. We're talking about millions of people, or probably even more. And in fact, this is
Especially probably now that our medicine is so good to bring people back, we
back.
have more frequency of people having these experiences.
And more frequency of people who are willing to share the experience and
That too.
acknowledge that. One of the challenges that was faced was even doctors who had the experience would refuse to talk about it because it was at risk of losing their license. So,
Mm.
I have the experience and I know what you're talking about. So you, the patient, you have this, you tell me about it. And even though I've had it as a doctor, I'm still not willing to talk to you about it or acknowledge it because I could lose my certificates or whatever, right? My license. So it was a very taboo subject for a long time. But a lot of doctors have now said, hey, I don't care that it's a taboo subject. I'm going to write books about it. And several of them have, and I'm terrible at remembering names and so forth. But just do an internet search. I'm not even going to promote one over the other. Just do an internet search on near death
Mhm.
experience and doctor, and you will see just all these different books that are coming out about this. The reality is that all of these kinds of experiences that go beyond the sort of consensus normal, are far more common than anybody realizes. There have been studies that have uh, looked at how many people have had something that's sort of an extra special kind of experience, and people, normally would say, "Well, yeah, I guess I know one person or two people," but the in cultures where it's taboo to talk about, when asked in a safe private setting, the numbers are more than 50% of people have had these. And people believe that tends to be conservative. In cultures where it's not so taboo, the numbers are more like 90% or higher of people who have had some kind of experience that just doesn't fall into the quote unquote normal. But in terms of the near death experience, the sort of the characteristics that happen here is that a person will escape the usual way of experiencing reality. Essentially, they'll go beyond what is the traditional, well, I'm here and the time is at such and such and a minute will have passed and therefore I've done certain activities and so forth, where they now find that they're experiencing reality in a much more expanded way. So, for example,
Mhm.
the sort of canonical case of this is somebody who's lying on an operating table, and they realize that they're looking down at their body from some point near the ceiling, and they're watching the doctors do certain things, and they're listening to conversations. Some of them talk about listening to the thoughts of the people in the operating room, not just what they're saying, but what they're thinking. People who will wake up later and say, "Hey, could you please go get my glasses, my whatever that you put in the drawer during during the operation?" You know, how could you possibly know that, right? But here they were watching it from above and seeing people doing things that they should not. You know, you were clinically
Mhm.
dead. How is it that you were able to perceive these sorts of things? And some of them who have gone completely outside the operating room will have traveled hundreds, thousands of miles to visit other places, to see other things, right? To have experiences that go beyond that. So there's a bit of an overlap in some sense between what are near-death experiences versus sort of a category called out-of-body experiences, where
Mhm.
people have left. And those each of those has a wide range of what that really looks like to an individual. Certain core characteristics of these, though, are especially with near-death experiences, people saying this experience that I had was the realest thing I've ever experienced. It felt much more real than any of my waking life moments. They tend to be very transformative. People who just look at the world in a very different way, look at their lives in a different way, see themselves as having either a greater purpose or a greater peace or both with who they are. It tends to be very transformative for the people who experience it because they realize that a lot of what they've been living on a day to day basis is sort of like being in a play. Um, they're following a basic script that's been laid out for them as opposed to a much broader experience, a much freer experience. They tend to almost all of them, as far as I understand it, have some measure of the sense of being of absolute inclusion or love from something much larger. And depending on the language that they use, they could say it is the love of the universe, the love of God, the love of whatever the different languages are that
Mhm.
people use to express it.
This is great. I appreciate you talking about it in more detail. And you mentioned sight and how like they're viewing things from a different way when they come back. But also, what I've been reading is that when they are in a state outside of their body, they literally have more sight, almost like a 360-degree of everything. They
Yeah,
have more ability to just. They don't have a body, so they see things around them as if basically they have eyes everywhere. Um, there's also this, I've read very frequently, there's a sense of also going through a tunnel, not just sometimes hanging in the corner of the room, but sometimes there's like they go through something to connect with possibly what we call, quote unquote, the other side, whatever that means, and that they meet sometimes people or beings or pets or loved ones from who have may have died. But as you said, everyone has different experiences, but there's some very common things a lot of people experience. It's not
right.
like um, each person experiences entirely different things. Like there's common grounds in a lot of these stories, which I think are amazing.
Yeah.
Um, a lot
And
of
you
data.
and the experiences that are there, the going through the tunnel or crossing a threshold, um, I think the underneath all of this, there's a common thing that is happening, a common kind of experience. And even when you have people have certain variations on how they say it, I'm going towards the light, I'm going into the light, I'm going through a tunnel, I'm crossing over a doorway into a portal. It's more or less uh, what, how people want or what is natural for people to try to describe that in words for an experience that really wasn't well described in terms of words, but the commonality that we have of these experiences, even if it's back to the process of birth, of going from something into the light, right, and through a
Hmm.
tunnel or through whatever it is, that at some deep level we recognize a symbology in all of this, and it's interesting that our symbologies are actually quite similar. They're, as you said, they're not widely varying for the processes that we have.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So, just to summarize, so far, what you basically talked about is that consciousness is something that is not you don't believe that it arises from our brain. It is something beyond our brain that exists, and can exist without the brain. So, I guess the question then is, if consciousness, if our awareness, if we do not arise from the brain, and you said, okay, the question of where does it arise then is not maybe an appropriate one, then I guess the question would be like, what is then consciousness? If time, if space is a construct of our consciousness, maybe in a way, is that kind of what you're saying? Then how does consciousness even arise then outside of our body?
Ultimately, to get to that is a metaphysical question, right? It's the core of where a lot of uh, spiritual and religious practices start, from this question of, there is the whole. There is this desire of, and religions will generally call it God, but not all of these are religious basis, right? But I don't particularly, I worry about the term God because that comes as a very loaded term. So when I talk about it, I think of it sort of as the universe, the totality of all things. It's the language that I'm personally more comfortable with. So you have this totality of everything, and in and of itself, a thing that is everything is not terribly interesting. It becomes interesting when you start to ask, well, what is inside of the everything, right? When you start asking, how do I look at a piece of this in contrast to another piece of this? So you at the largest level can have a consciousness that represents sort of the total universal consciousness, but the interesting parts are what happens when you start looking at the individual pieces of this, right? When you break down the everything into the Jeff piece of this and the Ina piece of this, and say, all right, these are going to be different slices of everything, right? Each one is not itself the total, but is a portion of that. Um, and then you you start to focus in, right? Now the question of what the role of the brain is in all of this, in this picture, right, is sort of most sensibly understood as a filter. How do you narrow that down? Why don't we just experience everything that there is to experience? Well, I can't even keep track of everything I'm supposed to do during a day, right? I mean, like, it's a lot. Imagine that I had to do that for 9 billion people, 9 billion humans. Now imagine I had to do it for 900 billion ants or whatever. Like, of all the different possibilities of what's there, it becomes just so overwhelming that in order to have some kind of meaning, to provide a lifetime of experiences that's interesting to pay attention to, you have to filter it down. And the brain as a filter actually is a much more sensible model, that what it's doing is helping you focus in on the individual parts that you're going to call your personal life, right?
So when you're saying the humans were basically created with brains in order to be able uh, to do what then in your kind of understanding of why consciousness.
What's the point of all of this? So,
Yes.
um, look, if you will give me a little bit of leeway, I'll share a story that kind of illustrates this pretty well. When I was in college, I took a philosophy class, and I had an assignment that was write a paper either proving or disproving the existence of God. And at the time, I was very not into religion and all the rest. I'm absolutely going to take the disprove the existence of God. And so here is the gist of my paper, which is, God is supposed to be omniscient and omnipotent. Right. I, on the other hand, am not. I am, however, I do have the capacity to learn. God, being omniscient, has no ability to learn because God knows everything. Therefore, I can do a thing that God cannot do. Therefore, God cannot be omnipotent. Therefore, that definition of God is falsifiable, right? There is no God in the standard definition of this. And I was very proud of this, right? Like, pat myself in the back. It's a phenomenal piece of logic you have there, Jeff. Well done, right? That was, and I did get an A on the paper, so like that says something. The years later, when I was talking about these aspects, I realized something really important, which was that there was an underlying assumption in the argument that I made, which was not articulated in the paper, and that is there was an assumption that I am not God, right? And when you look at this and you go, wait a minute, suppose for a moment that there isn't quite that same distinction of like, well, there's God and then there's Jeff, and there's no interplay between these two things. And okay, then the paper makes sense. On the other hand, if one looks at every person, every animal, every rock, every whatever, as some subset, some facet of the totality, right, that God idea, then what is it that we're actually doing here? We are having the experience of that little tiny portion of the totality of reality, right? That little portion that is, in this particular case, named Jeff. And I'm going through this roller coaster of a life and having all of these experiences, just as you're going through yours, just as my coffee mug over here is going through whatever coffee mug experiences that means for a coffee mug, and so forth. In other words, we are all, in a sense, a portion of God learning about itself, right?
Hmm.
And now we get to the point that you were making, which is, what are we doing in all of this? We're having the experience that is this tiny little sliver of, here's, can't see it because I'm putting my arms way out here, but you can't, they're all off camera, right? This whole experience of everything that is, and we're this tiny, tiny, tiny little infinitesimal fraction of it, but it's still a fraction that if you really want to know all of itself at the grand, you have to know that little portion as well, experienced in this particular way. And here I am doing that, and here you are doing that, and here my phone is doing that, and so forth, right? These are all different aspects of the universe knowing itself. And that's where we are. So how do you focus in on saying this is going to be Jeff, knowing Jeff at these different stages? Well, I have to go through that experience. And that means committing to a certain set of not outside imposed rules, but internally accepted rules that I'm going to live a human life and have a human experience, right? So there's certain things I'm going to do. I'm going to organize my whole life experiences in terms of saying that me as a baby comes before me as an old man. I'm going to agree that when I'm here at 59 years old, I'm willing to reflect on the things that happened closer to when I was a baby than to when I was an older man, right? Because that's part of the rules. And we all sort of agree to that. Some people don't agree to it completely, right? Sometimes you have precognitive dreams. Sometimes you channel in other ways and get information about the future. Sometimes you get hints about it, right? You look around and you become practiced at recognizing synchronicities that are telling, right? Oh,
Mhm.
wait a minute. That's a weird thing to have happened. That's rather odd. I wonder if this is suggestive of something that, were this to be a story, I would call foreshadowing, right? Uh, and you pay attention to those, and you get better and better at recognizing them. But still, I'm more or less agreeing to live the experience that I am, right? And I do that with whatever it takes to make that feasible. The brain being one part of that, something that allows me to focus in and have more or less the experiences of me as Jeff, as opposed to me as the cat on the other side of the room, or the bird that's flying outside the window, or the snow, or whatever it is. And I focus in that way.
Hmm.
And sometimes you get outside of that, right? You have experiences that go beyond that. And those
But it also
become
sounds like the brain is also limiting. Like our consciousness, when is in our body, it limits us to certain understanding of the world that is not the more, I guess, holistic version, but more of a very myopic version
right.
of what the brain can process at that time. And so it sounds like our understanding of the world is like a very minuscule part of what our consciousness is actually capable of. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Absolutely. Because for one thing, if you tried to experience a tremendous amount more, it becomes very difficult to articulate it in a way that makes for, essentially a good narrative, a narrative for us and remembering the things that we have, a narrative to explain something to somebody else to say, hey, this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. We have to be within a boundary of rules. Now,
Hmm.
interestingly, if you look at people who are having much expanded experiences, let's say, for example, somebody who takes a hallucinogen and having all these sorts of like incredible things where the standard rules of consensus reality are breaking down. So, well, if the brain is generating all this sort of thing, then when it goes to these incredible experiences, it should be getting very, very active. But that's exactly the opposite of what does happen. People have studied people taking, for example, psilocybin and seen that during all these experiences, what happens is the brain quiets down.
Hmm.
It's much, much less active than in normal waking hours. In other words, as a filter, it's doing less filtering. More experiences are coming in. When people talk about measuring the brain activity of people who are in deep meditation, same kind of thing. It's
Hmm.
quieting it down, and as a result, allowing more experiences, more diverse experiences, and maybe even more perspectives on the same experience to make their way through. Uh, so it does make a lot of sense, just as you summarized it, right? That what the brain, and I shouldn't just say the brain, but the nervous system as a whole, is doing, right? Filtering ourselves, but the filtering, I don't want to cast it like it's a bad thing. The filtering is incredibly functional. It's what allows us to focus in and actually have the experiences that we do. For
Hmm.
people who have had that expanded, complete loss of sense of self, I've had that myself a few times within my life. Right? It's an incredible experience, but you don't get a lot done during it. Right? It's not a human experience. And if what you want is a human experience, well, it's not practical to go along that way, at least not on an ongoing basis. So,
Yeah, I mean, from what I've also been reading is that, and listening to other people talking about this, like savants, for example, the people who have autism and are able to have these tremendous abilities to, let's say, fly over a city and take in the whole city and be able to draw it from memory in a very precise manner. On one hand, they have these abilities that allow for them to do this, and on the other hand, they're also very, very sensitive and are not able to function in the day-to-day world as maybe someone who doesn't have these sensitivities. And so maybe perhaps with greater abilities to expand consciousness, um, certain inhibitions that our brain usually has that maybe that person doesn't have also has a downside of not being able, like you said, to function in
right.
the day-to-day world as
Yeah.
human.
And a nice way for those of us who sort of do function in sort of the usual way, imagine trying to make the decisions, not only the decisions that are facing you in the moment, but at one time making the decisions that are facing you now, all the decisions that you made yesterday, all the decisions that you're going to make tomorrow, all all of that. You got to make all those decisions at the same time. Like, how in the world would you actually do that? How could you possibly have that extent of awareness and intention in the things that you do? That's kind of what it's like. At some point, there's so much that it becomes unmanageable. Or said alternately, the significance of it, the meaning and the value of any given thing kind of vanishes because there's so much. How do you actually say that this thing is going to be meaningful over something else? Or even draw the distinction between what is this thing versus something else for that matter.
Speaking of time, as you mentioned, how does that play into this whole picture? I mean, if our consciousness is within our bodies and it's very limited based on our biology, is time more of a construct from our biology? Is it something that exists outside of us? What are your thoughts about it?
So my thoughts certainly are that time is a cognitive construct. It's
Hmm.
something that we use to organize our experiences. As my mother enjoyed saying, time is what we use to make sure everything doesn't happen all at the same time. Uh, right? Like it's all right. Let me separate this out. Let me deal with some set of things and some other set of things without trying to do it all at once. There's for me a lot of evidence that time does not exist in the way that we typically are brought to believe that. Now, me, I have an educational background. My PhD is in physics. We have a very specific, within physics, we have a very specific idea of what time is, right? It's t. It shows up in this equation over here, and it does these sorts of things, and we can take these derivatives as a result of those. So there's a very, very precise concept. On the other hand, there's still things within that we tend to push off to the side. Like, well, all the equations in physics are actually perfectly time reversible, so it doesn't tell you that time flows one way or the other. We don't talk about that. That's okay. Don't worry about that, right? But there are other cases where the equations are telling us things. For example, the equations that talk about how information and energy flow, being from the past into the future, that's only one of two solutions to the equations that we use. There is another solution to those equations that has that has energy and information flowing from the future into the past. In other words, describing a universe in which it's not just causality that pushes us forwards, but some kind of future state, a future end point that is actually pulling us or attracting us towards that. And that is a topic that for me is very profound. It shows up in a variety of different ways. Synchronicities, I mentioned before, being one example of that. There's the principle that underlies it that is the complement to entropy, something called syntropy, which again is showing that information and energy can be flowing the other way. The influences are there. And it's something that within the last couple of decades has been demonstrated experimentally. That, for example, at a physiological level, we will respond to stimuli that hasn't come into existence yet. The measurements themselves that people are taking are things that have happened on sort of the multiple millisecond level. That, for example, will start to have a physiological response to something. Only then, after the physiological response starts, does the thing itself come into being. That's a long conversation, so we can go there if you want to, but I'll leave it at that. Um,
Yeah, well, if I may
it-
interrupt you just for a second, because you
yeah.
said a lot of things that are all really important. So taking you back a little bit, so you mentioned entropy and then syntropy. I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, syntropy is more of your word that you have coined, or is this coming from somewhere else?
No, it's a term that was coined probably about 100 years ago. Because you asked me right now, I can't remember the Italian guy's name who actually coined it. I'm going to struggle for it, so I'm not going to try at the moment, but we'll look it up. It's something that starts with an F,
I'm
and
looking it up now.
okay, and it's several syllables long. So it's definitely not my terminology.
Luigi Fantapié. Of course, I butchered
Thank
the last
yeah,
name. Fantapié?
that's the one.
My Italian is very, very bad.
Yep,
Fantapié.
yep. Well, I appreciate you butchering it as opposed to me butchering it because I would have as well. The but yeah, so it was a term that was coined. I actually only came across the term about 15 years ago. The ideas behind all of this were things that I had been contemplating and trying to work out. I came upon this in two different ways. One was from my personal experiences where I found that there were things that decisions I had made or experiences that didn't make sense in the moment, only made sense from some future point looking back and saying, wait a minute, now I see a causal relationship, but where the cause is something that happened later in time and explains an otherwise inexplicable behavior on my own part at some earlier point in my life. Another aspect of it, though, and probably a much stronger one for me, was when I took over running my charity, the International Consciousness Research Laboratories. I was now in a position of trying to explain to a lot of people the results of experiments that were done at Princeton during basically the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. And one of the aspects of that, this was done at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory. It was run by my mother and Dr. Robert John. My mother's Dr. Brenda Dunne and Dr. Robert John. Part of their experiments were to look at how does intention, or how what's the role of intention in determining the behavior of systems that have some stochastic, some random aspect to them? And what they found was that intention can play a role in how those systems behave. In other words, if you have some kind of, for example, electronic coin flipper whose odds are 50-50, that when a person has an intention to have more heads than tails, those probabilities will actually shift. Instead of 50-50, it'll be 49.99, 50.01, which isn't a big example, or pardon me, a big effect, except that if you're running this 10 million, 20 million, 30 million times, the odds of something like that become astronomical. The statistics say that this should be really, really on point, and it's not. Now, where we get to what we were talking about a moment ago in terms of time is that those experiments, I sit in front of the machine, I run it, and I see, okay, I can have some kind of effect on it. And then you say, well, what if I have my intention before the equipment runs? Okay, same thing. I still have the effect. What if I run the equipment and then I have the intention afterwards? Same thing, right? It doesn't matter that your intention was
Hmm.
there after the system was doing its thing, right? And now trying to explain this, how does that work? And people, questions like, well, does that mean that it originally resulted in numbers and the numbers changed? No, it didn't. But you go through a lot of these examples and then you like, how am I going to talk about the nature of causality that is not in a standard time only flows forward way? And this is where the topic of syntropy came up. And I said, aha, that's the term that I've been wanting to have for a very long time. Um,
If I may interrupt you just for a second, just so I
yeah,
can summarize, just to kind of, because there was a lot there.
sorry. Yeah.
And no, please, this is wonderful. So I just want to clarify, I'm understanding this correctly. So first of all, what you're saying, and please correct me if I am wrong, is that intention can shift probability. So if something has a probability of 50-50, intention can create a more likely probability for a particular outcome. So is that also kind of similar in a way, and maybe it's totally not parallel, but in quantum mechanics where there's two things that are superimposed, and once you observe it, you collapse it into a state. And so in some ways, intention also increases the chance of collapsing it in a particular state. Would that
You,
be similar?
yeah, beautifully put. When you take a wave function that is going to collapse into a made measurement, right? If you have no intention towards that, it'll do whatever it is going to do based on the statistics of the wave function. But when an intention is present, that can shift the result of that collapse. Now, it's a
Mm-hmm.
statistical process, and that's an important part of this. For
Mm-hmm.
example, in the experiments, you say, I'm going to I have this machine where a whole bunch of balls are falling down. They're going to create a bell-shaped distribution at the bottom. And I want more balls to fall to the left than to the right. Doesn't always mean that your intention is going to get more balls falling to the left. Sometimes you have the intention and the result is that indeed the statistics have shifted, but they shifted the opposite direction. It's a very complicated process that is not understood at this point as to what's all the things that are going into that, right? In part because we as beings are rather complicated. We don't really know our intentions, and
Hmm.
we're very self convoluted in this, right? I want this intention. This is my intention. But what if somewhere in the back of your mind there is that little doubt that said, wait a minute, maybe I can't do this. Maybe it should be something else. Maybe it shouldn't, whatever. Now, what are your real intentions that underlie all of this? Is it in fact to have it go the way that you want? Is it to go somewhere else? Interestingly, a lot of experiments have shown that people who are adamant about uh, this not being possible when they run the experiments get results that are so statistically in the middle that they're statistically unlikely. They don't even have the randomness they should have. In other words, they have an effect
Huh.
on it, but the effect is to eliminate natural occurring uncertainty in the process, right?
That's
For
brilliant.
example, their bell-shaped curves are too narrow. They don't
Right.
have the distribution they're supposed to, right? So what is your intention and how do you know that? It's very complicated. And of course, you've got, trying to map all this is where we are today in, and the amount of experiments that are required to really be precise about how all of this is happening is huge. We need to have a science that is able to speak to the subjective aspects of what's going on because it's a fundamentally subjective process. It's a consciousness related process. So it's hard. That's really what we're trying to do at this point, is to create a good model that would allow us to articulate, well, what exactly is going on here? Is this about emotions? Is it about relationships? Is it about
Mhm.
intention? But for example, how much can you not get in your own head? People who were very intellectual about it tended to not have as strong a results as people who could just take it from the heart, as you will. Kids tended to be better than adults. Animals much better than kids, right? They don't think themselves out of stuff. Animals just do, and so forth, right? So there's a
So
lot of complexity in this.
what you're also saying, and please correct me if I am mistaken about that one, is that on top of the importance of intention that you're talking about, there's also what was been observed in the studies that were done by your lab, by your mom's lab, um, is that time is also somewhat irrelevant in when the intentions are set. So if the intention is set post the event, and you don't know yet the outcome of the event, somehow the 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 result of the event will be slightly shifted by that intention. Is that correct?
Exactly. So, it
What if you
starts with
know? What if you already know the event's
so here's the
outcome?
here's the thing. When you what you need is a measure of humility when you do these sorts of things. If you believe that everything is absolutely set, right? And you say, well, it's impossible. This could not happen. What stands in the way of you doing something is your belief that it's impossible.
Mm,
For anybody I've ever met, if I look at a set of numbers on a piece of paper and I stare at those and I go, okay, here are the numbers and I'm going to try to change them, my mind just goes, no, no, here they are. They're right here. I'm not going to be able to have any effect on this. I could I do that if somehow I was able to truly back up and say, well, I can change those numbers. It's not just because it's written down doesn't mean that I can't change them. Maybe I don't have the ability to do that. I don't I don't have the I don't know strength of mind to say my experience of seeing those numbers doesn't actually set the numbers. And I think that's the case for nearly everybody. But when there's an uncertainty, if I don't know what those numbers are yet, then the effects are still the necessary uncertainty in the system is still there, and now the effect can happen. There was a really cool study that was done. I don't remember how many years ago, at least several years ago, where people took a set of resolved cases of people who had blood infections, and they'd had them 40 years ago, and they broke it out randomly into different sets. And one set they gave people to have an intention. The people didn't know who the patients were. They just knew, hey, you're going to have patient 1, 2, 3, 4, and we want you to have some kind of positive, loving intention on their ability to heal from this thing that they're going through. And then there was another half of that data where nobody had any intentions on it whatsoever. And they had people give whatever positive intentions that they did, however they wanted to describe it. You're sending love, you're sending prayers, you're sending intentions. You figure out what it is for each individual who wanted to do it. And then they looked at those two sets of results from those blood infections and the healing rates and what have you, and found that the set that people had had positive intentions towards recovered better, faster than the people who had not. Right? These were all cases that were already resolved decades earlier, right? And yet the uncertainty of knowing whether or not you would have some kind of effect was still there for those people. And hence they were able to have some kind of influence on the outcomes of those cases, right? So
in the past.
in the
Influence
past.
over the past. Yeah. This is
Exactly.
mind blowing. So how do you make sense of this physics wise or science wise?
The only thing that you have to give up is time, right? Like the what what you ultimately have to recognize is that we're not living solely in a unidirectional time only flows from or pardon me, intention and impact only flows from past into future. Rather, it makes more sense to look at the universe as being sort of a coherent, consistent thing unto itself. And one's intention, in a sense, changes and in physics, we would call it boundary conditions of this overall picture to say that, all right, I want this kind of result at the end of the day, meaning when I look at what I call future, I want it to be more like this. And that intention being put into it has an influence over the entirety of the system. And consequently, that's where things go. It's the problem that we have in understanding it is largely driven by our language. We're so used to talking about things and thinking about
Hmm.
things in terms of I first do this and I then do that. That the idea that we're simply doing all of these things and then putting them in time sequence in order to talk about it is tough because it defies the way we use language, and that makes it very challenging.
Have you ever watched the movie Arrival?
No,
It's
no,
a
not really.
sci-fi movie. It's fantastic. So the premise of the movie in Arrival, I highly recommend for you to watch it. I think you'll enjoy it based on everything you've been talking about, is that there's a scientist and an alien race comes to Earth and no one knows what they're about. And the scientist is a linguist who's trying to understand and learn the language of the aliens. And it takes a long time. There's a lot of stuff that happens. And ultimately, their language is so different that once she starts understanding and learning it, it starts to change the way that she perceives reality because their language is in some ways circular and outside of time. And so ultimately, and I don't want to give away the ending,
Yes.
but part of the gist of it is that once you learn that language, it opens up the way to create loops and see the world in a much more holistic, time-wise way where you can see different parts of a timeline all at once, which is
Yeah.
kind of what you're talking about.
I know, there are certainly different cultures just within this standard humanity history that view things differently, that have different approaches to language, that look at these, and people have studied these and realized that the capacities that people grow up with in those kinds of cultures are driven a lot by the way they think about things. Is
Hmm.
it, a culture that, for example, says it's either A or B, and those are your options. People grow up in that having a particular way of looking at the world. Cultures where it says it's either A or B, or A and B, or both not A and not B, right? All those different things. They grow up having a different way of viewing it. I know for me,
Hmm.
when I wrote my book, in that there's one culture that is very future focused, that's the syntropic world. And so trying to come up with how characters would speak, the ones who are from that world, what are the analogies that they would use? What are the metaphors? How would they phrase things? Like, because they wouldn't phrase things the way that somebody who's focused on cause and past focuses it. So as in writing that book, I developed the practice of trying to figure out how would I phrase this if I grew up in that kind of world. And that has absolutely changed my thinking, right?
Hmm.
I do things differently as a result of, and that's just me as an author writing something, right? Trying to practice writing things in a different way. So there's no doubt in my mind that the languages that we're using are forming the structure in which we interpret reality very heavily. And there are other ways of doing it.
So, is there anything in theoretical physics or any language in physics that could explain the construct of time as a construct, as possibly not being uh, the reality in itself?
I think there are. Certainly, quantum mechanics has a model that's much more amenable to that than classical physics, which has really got that very forward march in time kind of approach to way that equations are interpreted and so forth. But at the end of the day, it comes to the scientists themselves to how are you going to interpret, and how are you going to assert meaning into the equations? How are you going to um, what assumptions are you going to relax on in the way that you interpret something? So I think the equations would support it, but the dialogue is ultimately where it happens. And if you were going to be proposing something that everybody else goes, no, 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 you're out of your mind, and you're not going to get funding for that. And you go, well, okay, I need my funding, whatever, right? So, how much freedom you have to interpret things differently is going to be driven a lot by those practicalities, unfortunately. People who are not doing it in the academic world have a little bit more freedom because they're not fighting quite so hard for the same funding and the same promotions and so forth. So they're able to speak and publish a little bit more freely. But
So would that be you, though, in
yeah,
your lab?
I I don't publish a tremendous amount because the process of publishing is like an just a god awful chore. Um,
Mhm.
but we're starting to. I took over running ICRL as the president when my mother passed away, which was about 4 or 5 years ago. Um, and so now I'm starting to do a lot more of that. But it's, you don't just sort of wake up one day and like, I'm going to start publishing papers all over the place. It's a slow process to be put in place. And of course, I still, have lots of other obligations that, you transition into. But I would imagine as time goes on, right now, a lot of the things that I publish are in journals that I'm familiar with, fantastic journals from a place in Italy called the Perry Center, the Perry Perspectives Journal. Published a number of articles there and a few in a journal called, oh my goodness, my mind just, Paradigm Explorer from the Scientific and Medical Network, and a few others. But it's a growing it's a growing process of finding more time to
Mhm.
write, and so forth.
Sure. I mean,
Yeah.
so there's so many avenues I kind of want to take right now, but I'm trying to figure out which one I want to concentrate more on. So I, I want to maybe rewind a little bit because I don't think we touched upon it as much as we should. So you mentioned the idea of doing these experiments where there would be an electronic what are they called? Number simulator? No, number
Random number
producer?
generator.
Generator,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah,
Number generator. And then trying to figure out whether their intention and time has any factor in it. And then you were talking about entropy and syntropy and how somehow those two are related to this experiment, but I don't think we really discussed how or what entropy is or what syntropy is. Could we rewind a little bit to that?
sure. One thing I'll mention is for people who are totally new to this, the device called a random number generator, that's the most common term for it these days. It was something that when the laboratory started, it wasn't a big deal. They built their own at a scientific quality thing. They called them random event generators. And as time went on, the value of having huge sequences of random numbers that were unpredictable became very valuable for the encryption world, right? So, generating devices that produce truly random numbers became a thing that everybody wanted, and they didn't want just a few of them. They wanted billions of them at a time to make encryption keys all over the place. So today you can get a random number generator for a few bucks on the internet. You just, oh, look, random number generator, I want to buy one, and they're all over the place.
And you
But I
can get an
wanted
app, right? There are
what's
apps
it?
about it too. There
There
are
are
apps you
apps
can
about
get
it as
too.
well,
Yeah.
and some of them are tied into what they call true random number generators.
Mhm.
Others use pseudo random number generators, depending what it is that you want to do. That becomes a discussion about how you run scientific protocols. But the point being that there's ones that generate specific bits, 1 0 1 1 0 whatever.
Mhm.
The it does the effect, however, I just want to emphasize, it has nothing to do with the fact that you're generating digital binary ones and zeros. You can do the same thing with any stochastic system. So the experiments that were done at PEAR, yes, they used random event generators to do this, or random number generators, but they also used thermal devices, they used acoustical stuff, they used fluid mechanics based things, they used optical stuff, they used, right, like it made no difference to the experiments whether or not you were talking about computer generated quantum effects or anything else. As long as the uncertainty was there, that was the thing that mattered, that made a difference. It had to be a system that had some underlying uncertainty in the process, and as long as
Mm.
you had that, then the experiment was fine. But the the random number generators make things a lot easier to collect data and to do the analysis off of, so that's typically what people use nowadays. The idea of entropy and syntropy, the principle of entropy basically is saying that as the universe continues to go on, as it would, as the phrase, one might phrase it, things tend to become more disordered. And the sort of canonical example of this is you don't find yourself stirring your cup of coffee and then all of a sudden all the milk is on one side and not on the other side. Like it doesn't become more structured as time goes on.
Mhm.
Um, the notable counter example of this being life. Um, s- from an entropic perspective, all other things being equal, we would expect it more likely that humans would evolve into amoebas than amoebas evolving into humans. We're not supposed to get more complex as time goes on. We're supposed to get less complex. However, if you have an intention, if there is something that becomes the structuring element in all of this, then it goes the other way. And this is where the idea of syntropy comes into play. From an entropic perspective, things go towards being more and more disordered as time goes on. From a syntropic perspective, there is some point in the future, there's some future goal, if you will, or purpose that is pulling events towards it in a structured way and ultimately allows you to get to that point that is otherwise seemingly very unlikely to have just spontaneously shown up and all of your milk is on one side of the cup and your coffee's on the other side of the cup, right? It doesn't happen on its own unless there's some kind of structuring intention that takes it in that direction. And that's the complementarity between these two processes. If you take both of them and recognize the value that each has to offer and look at them together, we get a very nice understanding of why the universe is doing the things that it does, why we're having the experiences that we have, and so forth. When you take one of them and ignore the other, everything becomes rather lopsided. And then you
Mm.
can't really explain everything that's going on. The only way you can defend your scientific models is by saying, well, anything that doesn't fit that has to be wrong, which is not a particularly scientific mindset. You're not allowed to just go, well, I don't want to pay attention to that data because it doesn't support my point. Like you're supposed to have to take all the data and find models that fit all the data.
Mm.
That's the right way of doing science.
So
Um,
why do you think we don't hear about syntropy much? I remember in physics when I was taking in college in preparation for medical school, I remember learning about entropy. I remember learning about entropy in chemistry even, but I don't ever remember hearing the word syntropy.
nope. There's a tremendous amount of stuff that we don't hear about. Um,
Touche.
Yeah, it's driven by the way people want to see the world. So we have an expectation for the way the world is, driven largely by the people who are influential in drawing those pictures. In some sense, it may be as simple as if I'm going to get my funding, I have to make sure that you don't, and therefore I'm going to predispose the decision makers to accept one model of reality and downplay others. And a lot of it depends
Mm.
on the culture that you grow up in. So, for example, if you grow up in the United States, there's a certain expectation on what is considered acceptable reality. If you go to Brazil, which tends to have a lot of examples of things that fall outside that realm, there are examples there that are mind blowing.
Thank you for tuning in and listening. Please tune in to part 2 next Thursday, May 28th. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share the Quantum Couch with someone you think might love this space too. If you would like to reach out, you can email me at thequantumcouch@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. Just search for The Quantum Couch. Thank you for listening. Until next time, I'm Dr. Ina Conboy. Take good care, stay curious, and keep exploring. The information in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Listening to this podcast does not create a physician-patient relationship with Dr. Ina Conboy or any guest on this podcast. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you heard on this podcast.